Diane smirked when she saw me, right up until the process server walked in, and she realized I wasn't here to beg. I was here to destroy her world. My daughter-in-law recently had to make the long drive from her duty station in Washington State to her new station in Oklahoma and thought it prudent to have somebody accompany her for the long trek. With my son off attending ranger school, she chose the next logical option. Me. I wasn't too keen on the idea. A 25-year-old military officer should be more than capable of making a cross-country drive by herself, right? Besides, I did not want to spend the money on a trip I hadn't planned on taking. I had already made up my mind to say no when my wife stepped into the conversation. And by stepped in, I mean she practically stormed in. She was livid. "Damn it, Greg, what's wrong with you?" she snapped. "Your daughter-in-law asked for help, and you're refusing her? You need to be more supportive of our children. And haven't you been complaining about wanting to travel more? Well, here's your chance. I can't go because I'm out of vacation time, so this works out perfectly. You get a road trip, and all it costs you is a one-way plane ticket. How is that not a win?" Cornered by her logic and her volume, I relented. All right. I'll book the flight and let Mel know I've changed my mind." In no time, I had a ticket to Seattle and a plan in place. When I called Melissa back to confirm, she was immediately relieved, her voice full of gratitude. The following morning, still somewhat groggy, I was dropped off at the airport by my wife. Half asleep, I didn't even register that she didn't give me a kiss or even a quick goodbye hug. Just let me out of the car and drove off. Odd, but I chalked it up to lingering frustration over our argument. I could have sworn I saw her standing in the unsecured part of the airport, watching as I boarded the plane. That didn't make any sense, since she had to get back to work and needed to leave immediately. So I just decided that I must have seen things. When I arrived in Seattle, Melissa greeted me with a hug to let me know that Diane had called just a few minutes earlier. She wanted to make sure she knew the moment I arrived safely and had asked Mel to check in before we hit the road. "All right, let's get going," I said as I climbed into her Highlander. "I'll call her later once we're out of all this traffic. Too much road noise right now." Melissa shook her head. I promised to call right away. Without waiting, she pulled out her phone and dialed. Immediately after Diane answered, I beckoned for Mel to pass me the phone. "Here, let me talk to her and settle her nerves." But before she could pass to me, the look changed. Something was awry. "She just said she doesn't have time to talk. She will see us when we get back." She hesitated, then continued with her apology. "She just hung up, Greg. Sorry about that. Do you want to call back?" I frowned, but pulled out my own phone and tried calling her a couple of times, her cell, then her office. When she finally picked up, she sounded sharp, almost hostile. "What do you want?" she snapped. "I already told Mel I don't have time to talk. I'll see you when you get home." Then she hung up. I stared at my phone for a second before saying out loud, "What the hell was that?" Melissa gave me a flicking glance. "What happened?" I told her, and she shrugged again. "Well, maybe it's just an off day, okay? And you know just how stressful these last few days have been because of her bank being seized by the FDIC. Just relax, and we can work on this later, okay?" I had no counter-argument, so I let the matter drop. Most of the drive was spent catching up, and I didn't even bother trying to call again that day. By the time we arrived at a place where we were going to sleep, it was already quite late, so I didn't feel like risking yet another snapped answer to my call. The next evening, however, I tried 4 times, starting about half an hour after she should have been home from work. No answer. I left 2 messages. The next evening was more of the same. Calls went directly to voicemail. Somewhere in between the second and third call, I dialed one of Diane's coworkers to check in with her. Instead, I got her husband, who seemed uneasy or even anxious. After some fumbling, he finally acknowledged that Diane, his wife, along with some of the girls, had gone out for the evening. By itself, this wouldn't have raised any eyebrows, but then something strange happened. Roughly 30 minutes later, I received an unfamiliar call. When I answered, there was silence on the other end. I checked the number, didn't recognize it, but decided to call back. That's when things got weirder. The woman who answered said she had never dialed my number. She had no idea who I was, and with each further question I asked, she became increasingly irritated. When finally I asked if my wife was there, she became downright hostile before hanging up on me. By that time, I had convinced myself it was no more than a wrong number, just an honest mistake. But right then, literally as I was pocketing my phone, Melissa's phone started ringing. She looked at the screen and took it. She paused, her eyes frozen. Then she hit the speakerphone function. The voice on the other end was instantly recognizable. "It's Diane, Mel. Who else would be calling you?" Mel hesitated for a second, then said, "Sorry, Diane. I didn't recognize your voice. Greg's been worried here. Talk to him." She passed me the phone, but by the time I took it, the call was already over. This was getting weirder by the minute. That evening over dinner, Mel looked at me with an uneasy expression. "Greg, last night, I thought you were just overreacting about Diane acting weird, but now, I don't know, this whole situation is starting to feel off. I'm getting worried too." A cold feeling had begun to settle in the pit of my stomach. Diane's been acting strange for at least 2 months, but this is something else, I admitted. I chalked it up to work stress before, but now I'm not so sure. I need some time to think. I'll be at the bar. Mel began to rise as if to follow me, but I held up a hand, shaking my head. She hesitated, then sat back down, reluctantly letting me go alone. Instead of going to the bar, I went straight to the hotel lobby and pulled out my phone. A knot of unease tightened in my chest. If what I was starting to suspect was true, calling the wrong person could tip my hand, but I had to trust someone. After a moment of consideration, a name came to mind. Mike. He was an old friend, a retired army man like myself. Years earlier, I had helped him through a brutal divorce after his wife had cheated on him. He'd since remarried, which made him the least likely guy Diane would be involved with. If there was anybody I could call on, it would be him. When he answered, I didn't mince words. "Mike, I think Diane is screwing around on me," I said matter-of-factly. "She has been acting strange for months and then couldn't get me out of town quick enough this week. Can you gather some of your guys to follow her and get me anything she does? Pictures, dates, times, places, whatever you need, get. Be around tomorrow evening. We shall link up the week or in weekend." Mike didn't hesitate. "I got you, Greg." That night, I made one last attempt to call Diane at home. No answer. Finally, just past 11, she called me. "Greg, stop being such an ass," she snapped. "You act like you don't trust me at all. I'm sick of you calling and checking up on me like some sort of teenager. You're out of the damn army stop ordering people around. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was when you called Karen's husband asking about me?" I clenched my jaw but said nothing, letting her rant. "For the record," she continued, and the irritability dripped from her voice like honey, "I have either been out with Karen, the girls, or with my family every time you have called. If you don't believe me, you may ring them yourself." She heaved an exaggerated sigh. "Now I'm tired. I am going to bed. We will talk when you get home." I could feel the anger radiating off her, even through the phone. Instead of snapping back, though, I kept my voice level. "I was just worried about you," I said. "You've never been this hard to reach before, and I was afraid that something had happened. Besides, back when we were younger, you always asked me to call every night when I was away. Unless I was deployed." She paused for a moment before scoffing. "Yeah, I did. But that was when I didn't know where you were. I know you're with Mel, so it doesn't matter now." That hit a nerve. For the simple truth was, back in those days, she always knew where I was. She had my schedule, knew what base I was at, what I was doing. This time, she had no itinerary. She knew even less about my whereabouts than she used to. But before I could bring that into the conversation, the line went dead. No "I love you," no "good night." By the time Mel and I came home on Thursday evening, we were late. Diane was quite visibly upset and made it fairly clear that we had inconvenienced her by making her late for dinner. Everything she did had an edge to it. And that night in bed, not warm either. Friday morning, without so much as a kiss, she was gone to work. And that evening, she showed up after 10. No call, no nothing. By afternoon Saturday, weirdness escalated. At 4 or so, Diane disappeared into our master suite bedroom. A while later, the shower was still running. But when she at last emerged from the bedroom suite, she'd dressed to the nines. The short dress, heels, fully made up. "I have a baby shower to go to," she said. "I'll be back late. No need to wait up. They're serving wine and appetizers, so we might end up partying for a while." She never asked Mel if she wanted to come, never even mentioned it beforehand. Mel and I exchanged glances. This whole situation was getting harder and harder to ignore. Sometime that night, Diane came home, but I had no idea when. By morning, nothing less than an explosion would have roused her. About 9, the doorbell rang. Mike. He stood there, his face grim. My gut twisted. This wasn't going to be good. "Greg, can you give me a hand for a minute?" he asked, his voice unusually subdued. "Got my truck stuck in a mud hole. Need you to help pull it out. Wouldn't have bothered you since you just got back, but Nancy's still at church." I nodded. "All right, let me tell Diane and grab my boots." As we walked away from the house, Mike let out a long sigh. His face told me everything before he even spoke. "Greg," he said, his voice low and serious, "there's an envelope in the glove box. You're gonna need to see what's inside, but I'll warn you now. You're not gonna like it, Dot. Looks like Diane's been spending a lot of time with two of her co-workers. I don't know how long it's been going on, but every single night we watched her, she was with them. Last night, she stayed out until nearly 3 in the morning. He shook his head. "I'm sorry, man. Really am. But listen, we need to play this smart. Come back to my place, have a beer, and let's get you covered in some mud. We don't want her suspecting anything until you've got everything lined up. You ever hear about someone crying into their beer? That was me that day." I sat there, a bottle in my hand, trying to process the reality of what I'd just learned. Anger, betrayal, humiliation. It all mixed into one ugly storm in my head. I wanted to make her feel every ounce of the pain she dumped on me. I wanted to break those two bastards she was messing around with. But more than anything, I wanted to make sure I didn't lose everything I had worked for. Mike and I talked for a long time. He gave me the name of a solid attorney. By the time I stumbled home, drunk out of my mind, I had an excuse not to play the role of good old faithful Diane's husband. Monday morning came, and Diane left for work at her usual time. Shortly after, Mel packed up and headed off to her new post. As soon as the house was empty, I got to work. First order of business, calling the attorney Mike recommended. He seemed competent enough, and the fact that I'd known him since high school made me feel like I could trust him. One thing was already clear in my mind. There would be no forgiving and forgetting. It didn't matter what Diane said. This marriage was finished. Now, I just had to figure out how to walk away with as much as possible. Following my lawyer's advice, I started pulling together all the documents and financial records I'd need. At the same time, I found a way to tuck away some of our money. I couldn't hide everything, but I had a plan. The first step? Writing out large checks to the friends who had helped me catch Diane in the act. We had already agreed they would return most of the money once the divorce was finalized. By doing that, I managed to stash away $25,000. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was justifiable. If Diane's attorney or a judge asked, we could argue that it covered the expenses of the investigation. After all, there was no real way to prove how long we had been tracking her or what it had cost. The next morning, Diane left for work without so much as a goodbye. I took that as my cue and headed straight to my lawyer's office. The news wasn't ideal, but it wasn't terrible either. He believed we could protect the family farm and my military pension. Diane had a sizable 401k, and the plan was to let her keep it in exchange for leaving my pension alone. As for our small vacation home on the lake, we'd use that as leverage. She could have it instead of coming after the farm. That left only our brokerage and bank accounts, which would be harder to shield legally. I leaned back in my chair, considering the next steps. "Go ahead and prepare the paperwork," I told him. "But don't serve them yet. Wait for my signal." David frowned. "Why delay?" "I need to talk to a few people first. Make sure no one sees this coming." He gave me a look, one that said he knew exactly where my thoughts were headed. "Greg, just remember, don't do anything illegal. No confronting her or those guys in a way that could get you into trouble. And for the record, hiding assets is also against the law." I smirked. "Now, David, you know I'm a law-abiding citizen. Something like that would never cross my mind." He let out a dry chuckle. "Sure, just like I remember a certain high school senior who once completely wrecked a guy's car and his face for moving in on his girl back in 1970. As I recall, that kid looked an awful lot like you. So, in case I'm not mistaken, I thought I'd mention the legalities." I laughed, clapping him on the back. "Good memory, David. You've done your job. I'll be in touch." As I walked out of his office, old memories came flooding back. That night so many years ago, David had been the one to drive me home. I had been hurt pretty bad, but not nearly as bad as Brad, the guy I had beaten to a pulp for putting his hands on Valerie. Brad had been the golden boy, the starting quarterback of our championship team. I had seen him hovering around Valerie a few times throughout the school year, but I hadn't acted, just given him a warning to back off. And Valerie? I had made it crystal clear that if I ever caught her with someone else, it would be over. Turns out, she hadn't believed me. Or maybe she just thought she'd never get caught. That night in high school, I caught them alone in the dark, too close for comfort. Brad stood there adjusting his clothes while she pleaded for him to stay. That was all it took. The fight that followed wasn't just about her betrayal, it was about the sheer disrespect of it all. By the time it was over, Brad was the one left bruised and beaten, surrounded by half the people at the party. Valerie sat there crying, while David helped me off the makeshift battlefield. I never spoke to Valerie again. A few weeks later, she mailed back my promise ring. That was that. Now, decades later, I found myself sitting on the patio, a glass of Glenlivet in hand, staring out over the small stream running alongside our yard. I had a lot on my mind. When Diane got home from work, she must have decided it was time to play the doting wife. She came over, gave me a hug, and settled into the chair next to me. "Why are you breaking out the good stuff so early?" she asked. I turned my gaze toward her and spoke evenly. "Just thinking about high school, about my first love. Caught her cheating on me, beat the hell out of the football player she was messing around with, and walked away. Never looked back. I guess some people just think they'll never get caught, or worse, that if they do, they can have both their spouse and their affair with no consequences." As I said it, I watched Diane closely. Her face drained of color, then flushed a deep red. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" she snapped. "You still think I did something wrong while you were gone? I was lonely, Greg. I spent time with friends and family. That's not a crime. Get over it." She shot up from her chair and started toward the house. I waited until she was just a few steps away before speaking again. "I wasn't really thinking about that," I said slowly. "But since you brought it up, something wasn't right, and we both know it. If I find out for sure that something happened, you know this marriage is over, don't you? You've told me more than once that if you ever caught me cheating, that would be the end. You should know I feel the same way." Diane stopped just outside the door, her back still to me. "You sound pretty sure of yourself," she said. "If you really think I did something wrong, why don't you prove it?" She disappeared into the house, leaving me with nothing but a miserable excuse for a sandwich at dinner. In the following days, I made several trips to the bank, each time withdrawing small amounts, never enough to trigger any reporting requirements. Things were still tense at home, and on top of everything else, I was dealing with an unwelcome dry spell. By Monday morning, I was ready to make my next move. As Diane was getting into her car for work, I casually leaned against the door. "Oh, I almost forgot to mention," I said. "I saw an ad online for a dirt cheap hotel and flight package to Vegas. Booked it on a whim. Just going to be a couple of days. I'll be back Friday evening. You don't mind, do you?" It wasn't unusual for me to take gambling trips. I did it a few times a year, but normally I gave her plenty of notice. This time, I wanted to see her reaction. Diane's face brightened. "No, honey, I don't mind at all," she said, almost too quickly. "Actually, I think we could use some time apart. We've both been on edge lately. Have fun, and try not to lose too much." She got in her car and drove off without so much as a wave. Before I hit the road, I made one more stop. Mike's place. Handed him another large check made out to Mike's investigations, and told him to keep an eye on Diane while I was gone. In Vegas, I made sure to lose another $20,000. On top of that, I managed to gather discarded receipts for all sorts of purchases: clothes, boots, hats, even some used show tickets. By the time I was done, I had documented enough expenses to justify a much larger financial hit than usual. At that point, I figured I'd done enough. I hated the idea of losing half of our investments, but I also knew I had to be smart. If I got greedy, I'd risk getting caught. Technically, I was supposed to return home Friday, but instead, I came back Thursday night. Diane had her usual girls' night out planned, which gave me the perfect opportunity to set things in motion. First thing Friday morning, my attorney filed the divorce papers. I had arranged for Diane to be served just before noon, right when she was preparing to leave work early for her usual routine. I made sure to be at her office before the process server arrived. By the time she walked into the room, I was already sitting comfortably, chatting with her boss, who, surprise, surprise, happened to be one of her lovers. The moment she saw me, her entire expression changed. She never expected me to be there, and now, she couldn't leave. From where I stood in Dean's office, I had a clear view of Diane's desk. She was glaring at me, her expression a mix of fury and disbelief. I stayed where I was, waiting for the process server to reach her before delivering the final blow. The moment she was served, her face went pale, then twisted in rage. "You son of a—" she shrieked, springing to her feet, ready to storm into her boss's office. Hearing the outburst, Dean, her boss, and, as I had come to learn, someone far too familiar with my wife, stood up, alarmed. I took a step toward him just as the process server entered his office, extending another envelope. Dean hesitated before taking it, his expression darkening as he flipped through the paperwork. He wasn't just receiving his copy of my divorce filings, he was also being served with an alienation of affection lawsuit. And, to make things even more interesting, the bank itself was also being sued for failing to enforce its non-fraternization policy. Dean went pale, sinking into his chair. Diane stormed into the office, still cursing at me, but Dean barely reacted. He was too busy staring at the papers, realizing how deep in trouble he was. Before they could recover, a commotion erupted toward the back of the office. Looked like the other recipient of the lawsuit, Carter, Diane's other lover, was just now getting served as well. Perfect timing. I smirked and adjusted my jacket. "Well, I'll be on my way now," I said casually. "I imagine the three of you will have plenty to discuss at your little night out tonight. Enjoy." Diane's eyes burned into me, but I didn't stop. "I have other plans myself," I continued. "Couple of lovely ladies I need to visit. Oh, and Diane, when you get home tonight or tomorrow, you'll find all your belongings in the garage. The guys and I packed everything up this morning. Your keys won't work anymore, but don't worry. I left the garage open for you." I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a thick folder, and tossed it onto Dean's desk. "Copies of the investigation reports," I said. "You'll want to keep those for reference. I have 2 more copies to deliver, to 2 very special ladies." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the office. Out of Diane's life for good. Dean and Carter wives weren't exactly thrilled to see me when I showed up at their doors. But their anger wasn't directed at me. It was reserved for their cheating husbands and Diane. Once I laid out the evidence, they didn't waste any time. I handed them David's contact information, letting them know he was a solid choice for a divorce attorney. In the end, they both hired him to represent them in their cases. As for my divorce, after some back-and-forth negotiations, it played out just as expected. I kept the family farm and my military pension. Diane got to keep the lake house and her 401k. But thanks to the cash, I managed to pull aside and a conveniently low appraisal on the farm, courtesy of some well-placed connections. I walked away with about 63% of our total assets. A hell of a lot better than the standard 50-50 split. In the months that followed, Diane found herself increasingly isolated. Most of our old friends had cut ties with her. The few mutual acquaintances we had left were kind enough to let me know in advance if she'd be at an event so I could steer clear. I had no desire to see her, and when I did, I kept my distance. If forced into an interaction, I remained barely civil, and that was only for the sake of our 2 sons. She wasn't the same woman anymore. The stress had taken its toll. She looked older, worn down. Turned out, my little lawsuit shook things up at her bank more than she expected. Between the scandal and the investigation, Dean, Carter, and Diane were all let go. With no high-paying job to fall back on, she had to take a second job, as a bartender, just to make ends meet. As for my lawsuit against her former employer, the payout wasn't massive, but it was enough to buy myself a nice new F254X4 Power Stroke. And, if I'm being honest, the satisfaction of watching her life implode was worth more than the money. But life moves on. Now, all that's left for me to do is figure out who I want to share the rest of it with. At my age, the dating pool isn't exactly overflowing, but there are a few interesting prospects, and in the meantime, I travel, I meet new people. Some of them are very nice, some of them are even willing and lovely ladies.